So, first week back at the Lords, starting rather late, but I have to say that it's been a very full and busy week. And I thought, as part of trying to explain a little bit about the Lords, that I'd talk about how laws are made, something I've discussed before, but because I was involved in a really interesting debate yesterday, which I put online, talking about secondary legislation and the way that statutory instruments and a range of different devices are used by the government, the executive part, the ministers, to avoid parliamentary scrutiny, and where things are decided far away from any public view. And in this instance, the way laws should be made, strictly speaking, is that they're always discussed in Parliament. That's the public bit, and that's where the MPs, legislature, and the Lords have the debates about what laws are being made. It's in full public view. The MPs represent the public, the scrutineers are the Lords. But if in fact there are laws that are being made, which there are regularly, where parts of what is made legal or illegal are decided by ministers, then that is considered to be a real challenge to democracy, and it's increasingly happening, right? So that all sounds a bit technical, but it's very important. So we were discussing these reports yesterday. Yesterday was Wednesday, or whenever you're watching this, by these committees: the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, government by diktat, and the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee, who brought out Democracy Denied. So what you should know is that there are lots of committees in the House of Lords, and they're not just talking shops. I'm unlikely to ever get on a committee because you have to be part of a party who fights to get you on the committee. And to a certain extent, I'm too busy. I don't necessarily want to be on one. But at first I was a bit cynical. I was thinking, all these committees meeting, what are they up to? But some of them actually do a really important job of work. There's things like the Built Environment Committee, there's the Constitution Committee, and largely they're talking about the things, it's pretty obvious what they're talking about. These two committees, which sound dull as dishwater, do something hugely important, which is every time a law is being discussed, a new bill is out, the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee go through that bill and identify every time the executive try and grab power. In other words, where powers are delegated to them. And they look at whether that's justified or not. And then they put a report out. So whenever I'm about to go and discuss a bill, there will be a Delegated Power and Regulatory Reform Committee report. And then the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee then take all of that work done by the DPRRC, and they then scrutinise that use of secondary legislation and comment on whether it's appropriate or not. So I really loved these reports because I was dreading reading them, even though I thought they were important. But actually, although they are difficult and technical, and sometimes, made my eyes hurt, actually everyone should read them. And one of the most important things is that they decided to do something which never happens in the House of Lords, which is to try and write them with a view to the public reading them. This is the first time I've ever noticed this, because they decided that it's so important what happens with lawmaking. Now, to give you an example is best. If you remember during lockdown, that dystopian time that we all want to forget about, there was all this guidance around. And the problem was that half the time you didn't know whether you were breaking you remember those rule of 8, rule of 4, whether you're allowed to go to do exercise once a day. The exercise once a day, the police thought it was the law, right? Because it was guidance. You should go, actually, and would go around and shout at you. And we all thought, well, you break the law if you did it more than once. Actually, it ended up being that was entirely advisory guidance. There's 3 forms of guidance, and they use guidance a lot, the government, to basically make things illegal without us noticing. Now, we all remember that period of guidance because of lockdown, but apparently if you go on the Department for Education website as we speak, there's like 63 new pieces of guidance that have been announced by the government that are on the Department for Education's website, with a big sort of comment at the beginning saying every school and every head teacher needs to implement this guidance. It then says, unless you've got good reason. And then it says that certain types of guidance are actually legally bindable, mandated. And if you've got any confusion, check the guidance page. And as one of the Lords said yesterday, what this basically means is that it's government making decisions. Nobody's discussed that in Parliament. No one knows anything about it. It's been decided by ministers. But you could be criminally breaking the law if you broke a piece of guidance. So you can see that there's important things going on here. There's a chapter 2, reasons for and against delegated legislation. And then it explains what is delegated legislation. For me, this was like a godsend. It explains Henry VIII powers, skeleton legislation. Skeleton legislation is when a bill looks really short and people like me think brilliant. But what they do is they say, broadly, this is what we want to do, and leave us to sort out the details. We'll fill that in, right? This is incredibly dangerous because this gives power that's completely unaccountable, and it is government by fear, and it's very dangerous. And we know, because we lived through lockdown, what it's like when you can't challenge issues. You'll also know from lockdown as well, often people would say to me, why didn't you ever vote against the mandated vaccines for care workers? Well, that's because it was a secondary piece of legislation, and so what would happen was we were given a bit of time for debate, but we couldn't ever challenge it. You can't amend secondary legislation. There's nothing you can do. So they were laws introduced with huge consequences. In that instance, 40,000 people were sacked because they wouldn't have a vaccine from the care service. And nobody in Parliament could challenge it. You could make a speech. That really was a talking shop. So that's why it's important. On that, so I quite enjoyed that debate. I have to say that although I made a reasonably all right speech, I hope, I made the point about unnecessary laws. I made the point about bills that were often so big that they, you couldn't ever wade your way through it. Nobody even knew what they were about. But these secondary legislation points were the key ones. Is this politicians' attempt at micromanaging every conceivable aspect of the public's autonomous choices because they don't trust voters? But actually, all the speeches in that debate were brilliant, excellent, really useful, and I learned a huge amount from them, which I don't often say from debates in the House of Lords. But there was a bit of an anti-Brexit theme running through a lot of them, because a lot of the arguments were things like when Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament and kind of went against parliamentary sovereignty. But what I realise now is that politicians think that democracy is parliamentary sovereignty, and that the big tension is between government and Parliament. Nobody ever talks about the voters, the electorate. So I wanted to draw attention to the fact that sometimes Parliament act against the voters. And of course the best example was during the Brexit period when they tried to stop the wishes of the demos, and eventually the government used some of these fiats to push through to actually enact what the people wanted. And that has been true in relation to some legislation I've discussed in the House of Lords, such as the Northern Irish Protocol Bill, which it looks like Rishi Sunak's losing his bottle on and won't ever push, where it's kind of pushing it. They're trying to push against a parliamentary bloc, these kind of things. So that's that. But somebody made a really brilliant point, which was, I had made the argument that there are too many laws, that why is everything legislated for? And I do believe that that is a real problem. And then somebody said, well, one of the reasons why there's a lot more laws coming through the House of Commons and the House of Lords at the moment is because for the first time, for a long time, we're making our own laws. And why is that? Because actually, for decades, we never made our own laws. The EU made a lot of our laws. And all that used to happen was that the EU would come up with what we had to do, and the House of Commons and the House of Lords would kind of rubber stamp the legislative programme that had been decided by Brussels, with UK representatives there. So actually, one of the reasons why now suddenly you have to think about legislating on everything is because we have to grow up, do it ourselves. And actually that's a very positive thing, but it also indicates a weakness because the British establishment relied so much on the legislative programme of Brussels and the EU. It is underskilled in the writing of law and in legislation. So I thought that was bit technical but important. I recommend you read the reports and look at the debate. One law that I have definitely argued is unnecessary is the Public Order Bill. The Public Order Bill is now, it seems to me, even more redundant than it was the first time, because Extinction Rebellion have announced that they're not going to do those actions that the bill was designed to stop, even though, in fact, the police have public order bill powers already. Huge amounts of them, a whole armoury of public order legislation already exists, which they won't enforce. The government, started by Priti Patel, carried on by Suella Braverman, wanted to be able to say, we brought out this bill, we're going to clamp down on all those Just Stop Oil types, and there's a lot of draconian things in there that will not just be used against the people that they say that they're aimed at. Now they've announced that they're not doing those actions anymore. You'd think this bill was redundant, but like a bad penny, it's back. So we're to be on report stage in a couple of weeks, and the famous, in my mind, Clause 9, which is a particularly difficult issue that's been very controversial, is whether the law should now instigate buffer zones around every facility, every medical facility that offers terminations and abortions. As you all know, that was very controversial, and although I'm pro-choice, don't have very much sympathy with any of the people standing outside in the buffer zones, or standing outside, praying or trying to say to women that they shouldn't have abortions. Despite that, from a civil liberties point of view, I argued against the legal buffer zone rule. And so I'm going to be in the midst of that in a couple of weeks' time. Watch this space. But I wanted to recommend to you, if you're interested in that topic and want to hear both sides, that the Free Speech Union have got a very interesting debate on Monday the 23rd of January. Both sides represented. Certainly the person who's been, a good friend of mine, somebody I really admire, Anne Furedi, who she and I disagree on this question. She's going to be arguing why the buffer zones are necessary. And Ryan Christopher, who's very much of the opinion that the buffer zones are an attack on civil liberties, but is also somebody who's been associated with anti-abortion issues as well. But he's a very good debater. They're going to be having it out with others. So I'd recommend it's a public debate, and we can put the details beneath and you can go along. The other big issue that I was discussing this week was the financial services legislation. I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd be discussing financial services, but I was actually just only making a speech about the way that certain financial services, not just the City of London or the way of banking, but in a new online world, we have to deal with something else, which is we just assume if you've got a website, if you set up any kind of organisation, that you'll use something like PayPal just to kind of administer membership fees, or if you've got an event on, or donations. And we saw at the end of last year when PayPal suddenly cut off the Free Speech Union and the Daily Sceptic and Us For Them and Law and Fiction stopped their funds coming. So I wanted to make a free speech speech in amongst the financial services bill. Majority of major payment providers grant themselves the right to block accounts of those whose views clash with Silicon Valley's increasingly ideological corporate values. So I intend to put in an amendment to say that while I understand that private companies have a right to choose who they do business with and should be vigilant about fraud and illegal transactions, they should never discriminate on the basis of an organisation's political, philosophical or religious beliefs. And this bill might be a place where we can put it right. And I think it's important to constantly be vigilant as to the ways that free speech is under attack. It's not just always written, this is a free speech attack. That's the point I'm making. So I intend to carry on ever vigilantly, even in the most unlikely pieces of legislation, looking for opportunities to argue for freedom of expression. And it's just been announced that the online safety bill is coming to the House of Lords on February the 1st. So I'm already anxious about what that's going to mean. There's very few of us in the House of Lords who will oppose it, but I will certainly be opposing those censorious aspects of that piece of legislation, which I really do think is a threat to freedom of expression. Next week, I'm going to be concentrating on another bill that's coming through, which is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. The whole Levelling Up agenda, led by Michael Gove, has produced with it the most enormous bill that I can't possibly work through, which is my homework for the weekend. And I've got to come up with ideas for what I want to argue. It's a perfect example of where you don't actually need one piece of legislation. It's like a policy document dressed up as law with all sorts of manners of mad legal and regulatory regimes attached to it. What I'm going to concentrate on is discussing housing, something which I feel that, you know, if you wouldn't need a levelling up bill, if, for example, you would have a straightforward project of house building, tackling the crisis in renting, the crisis in leasehold, the fact that there just are not enough homes for people, that the homes that people are living in are not fit for purpose in many instances. If you ensured that you had the infrastructure and a dynamic economic project on the horizon that would encourage people to want to live in certain areas because there was something worth living there for, all of these things, but instead they've got a bill. But nonetheless, I will be ploughing my way through that and make sure that I try and represent as much as possible the voices of people who don't get a chance to speak in the House of Lords. And that's really where I wanted to finish off. I feel as though I've been very busy this week, and the Lords have been quite productive, and in terms of speeches, in terms of having lots of meetings, but all the time I'm just conscious of the gap between what happens in Parliament and the concerns of people outside of Parliament. One of the things which is really agitating me at the moment is the fact that in what can only be described as almost like immature student union style politics, the government's way of dealing with the recent, the present strike wave, huge numbers of public service workers going on strike, is to bring in an anti-strike bill, you know, with this minimum services bill. And they kind of like, you know, like pontificating like it's some Thatcherite, you know, fight against the unions, trying to destroy the government. And on the other side, you've got this kind of nonsense, which is the unions are all heroic, and you know, and then accusing the Tories of being Thatcherite and trying to destroy the unions. And it's like it's a pathetic little bill that says there should be minimum service, and that's why strikes shouldn't happen in certain public services. The truth of the matter is, the crisis in British society, outside of this posturing around politics, is that there is not minimum service when there's no strikes happening. There is a genuine problem of not being able to get minimum service when you want to catch a train, and much more seriously if you want to have a baby and have maternity services or go to the hospital. We know all these things, and it seems a complete distraction to try and resolve these by a piece of legislation that won't resolve anything, and it's a way of avoiding tackling the difficult questions. I still stand by the fact that I support the right to strike in all circumstances. I can have qualms about some of the strikes that are happening. That's fair enough. I'm not a trade union member of those unions, so, you know, I can have qualms enough, but I will support their right to take action, because actually standing up for yourself and saying that you're going to take action is the one thing that I would encourage everyone to do, whether they're in a union or not. And if you happen to be in a trade union, you understand why that happens. But using the law to try and play out political, left-right politics is, in my view, a way of not tackling the real problems that everybody faces at the moment, which is an economy in stagnation and public services not fit for purpose, and nobody prepared to really take on those difficult issues. And that's what members of the public want, and I'll keep saying it. Have a good week.